What is your plan for the next time you recruit? What stage are you at in your life and career? What experiences are you hoping for in your next school, city, and country? As international educators, we become accustomed to searching for new jobs and then transitioning to new schools and locations. However, if you were to explain to a non-international educator that recruiting means deciding to accept a job in a foreign country at a school you probably have never visited, I bet you would get a strong reaction, likely along the lines of, "What in the world are you doing?" To assist you in making this big, life-changing decision, we once again reached out to our trusted veteran panel of Amy Hunt, Rob Howe, and David Ross, this time to discuss how to make such an important life pivot. Our guiding question was, when putting your recruiting plan together, what are some key criteria to guide you when looking at potential schools, cities, and countries? Here are some of the topics covered in this episode. Understanding yourself, assessing your current stage in life and career, as well as clarifying your values. Researching prospective schools, what to look for and how to evaluate your options. Creating a recruiting plan, listing the criteria that you desire in your next school, city, and country. Defining your no-goes, as in the non-negotiables for your search. Unpacking of a great many criteria from our blog post entitled Profiling Schools, Cities, and Countries. Parting advice, final thoughts and recommendations from our panelists. This show was recorded on June 19th, 2025. Bask in the comfort of knowing that, once again, our veterans are here to share their experiences as they shed light on many of the criteria that may not be as familiar to you if you're just beginning your overseas adventure, or that you may not have contemplated in past moves as a veteran yourself, but may decide to add to your list for your next recruiting effort.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Educators Going Global podcast. We're so excited to have our panel of experts on once again. And we'll just do a quick welcome and where in the world are you? Starting with Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm on the San Francisco Peninsula.
Fabulous. And Rob?
I'm in Tucson, Arizona.
Woohoo! And David Ross.
Hi, I am in actually Phoenix, Arizona, just down the road from Rob, visiting family from Orange County in California. So it's a bit hot out here, as Rob knows, but I'm in Arizona this time.
Nice. Hello to family. And Carpy.
I'm in Boise, Idaho, not too far away from our friends.
Fantastic. And I'm in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. So I am also in the Pacific time zone, which is great. Made it so much easier to coordinate this one. So welcome everybody. And today what we want to do is kind of dive into we made a blog post about this, and we also made a spreadsheet sharing some of our criteria that we would propose for teachers looking to change jobs and looking at new schools to consider. And since we're going to talk about that, wondering if any of you has a going global story to share that might kind of address the whole criteria thing. I'm thinking like maybe a school that you had a great time at that didn't quite meet your criteria. Anybody got a story to share?
Well, I'd be happy to hop in here.
Great.
I actually, many moons ago, had gotten out of international school teaching for a little while and came back into it. And my wife and I took a job in Lebanon, and it was quite an experience. That part of the world was of huge interest to us. We'd never really spent time in the Middle East. But once we got there, we realized that it was really very great cultural experience, incredible memories, incredible food, time together with Lebanese. However, experiences in the classroom were less than desired, let's say. Many stories to talk about on that front. But it was a very exciting 2 years. I would just say that it was not what we expected. I'll leave it at that.
So I have a story that I can tell a little bit about going to a school that was a really good fit, and then it wasn't a good fit anymore, and we moved away. So my husband and I had been overseas for 8 years at two schools, and then we were back in the States in Minneapolis, and we were great. He was the head of a school in Minneapolis, and I was working at a school. Kids were in a Spanish immersion program. We were happy to be back in Minneapolis. But we knew that we were going overseas again. So we kept our eye on things. And so I remember my husband was upstairs and he yelled down, he goes, "Oh, looks like I have an interview at the American School of Barcelona. Do you want to go?" And I was like, "You mean for 3 months from now?" And he was like, "Yeah, their head just quit out of the blue." And I was like, "Okay, let's just try it." And then he got the job. And we were like, okay, like we are a Spanish speaking family. We've been wanting to go to Europe. Off we went. And we had a great time for 4 years. It was a perfect move for us. Really safe neighborhood. Kids could walk everywhere, even when they were little. Just a wonderful experience. And then as my son got toward high school, all of a sudden it was like, this isn't the right school for us anymore. I had a lot of things that I wanted to do that I couldn't do there. And my husband, I think, also had a bigger motor than he was showing there. And we made a move to a school that had many more resources for our sort of gifted, very creative, artsy, project-oriented kinds of kids. And so I think that for me, that was always illustrative of the fact that we were so glad we went and we jumped and it was a great fit. And then all of a sudden, we didn't really fit anymore and found someplace else to go that was a much better fit.
So what I love about that story is that it sounds like you kind of made a decision just based on a gut feeling like, yeah, okay, let's go to Spain. Why not? And
Yes.
that is, this show is about making an informed decision. And so I just want to highlight that it doesn't always come down to that. It's good to know that the criteria are there, and there are times when you have maybe two schools you're comparing or three schools you're comparing, and it's good to have kind of some check boxes to think about. And then there are times when it's just like, I'm going with my gut.
Yeah. And I think that we recognized that was the hook that was going to pull us back overseas. And then the second school was quite well informed. We knew exactly what we're getting into when we went back to Brazil at a different school. So, and that was a really deliberated, conscious, intentional decision that we really poured over. So one was and one wasn't, but they both worked out great.
Although I'll jump in with one if that's okay. Similar stories to Amy and Rob, and ours was in Malaysia. We spent 6 years there, and great school. We had a great 6 years. We left on a high note. But the thing that didn't work out so well was that Malaysia has a high crime rate. And it's something that one needs to keep in mind when living in Malaysia. One needs to be vigilant there. And I don't know if it's gotten any better. We were there from 2006 to 2012, those 6 years. And we learned to be very vigilant with, petty thefts, purse snatching, things like that. And we didn't like it, but there were so many other great things about it that kind of made up for it. But that is something to consider when moving to a country is your safety.
Oh my gosh, that just is coming out of left field. I didn't know that. So
Surprising, huh?
very surprising. So as this whole show will be about doing your research, knowing yourself, but also knowing the profiles of the potential schools that you're applying to. So safety is going to be one I think we're going to get to. All right, so let's take a look at our guiding question. And I'm going to offer a little bit more information as we set up this discussion. So our guiding question is, when putting your recruiting plan together, what are some key criteria to guide you when looking at potential schools, cities, and countries? So we're not just looking at schools, we're looking at the cities and the countries. So in asking this question, we asked each of our panelists here to not repeat each other. so that our listeners could have more of a variety. So this is not a definitive list. We're not saying here are the 6 things you have to look for. We're trying to show a variety that connect to the experiences of each panelist. So that's where I think a lot of the richness is going to come out as they describe their take on the criteria and their experiences. And realize there are multiple other factors that can affect which criteria seem most important, is whether you're single or married, you're a first timer seeking an international job, do you have children, what stage in your career are you, and lots more. So those factors come into play as well. So our main hope here is that you, our listeners, will access our blog post that's at our website. It's entitled Profiling Schools, Cities, and Countries. And hopefully that will help you prepare for recruiting season with knowledge about yourselves and your potential schools. And just as Audrey was saying, and the whole panel was alluding, while keeping your options open for unexpected opportunities. We always talk about flexibility and adaptability, so that's huge. All right, with that said, we're going to take turns with each of the panelists offering a criteria. And then if folks have something to share, they're going to jump right in. So, Amy, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I'm glad that you said that about your sort of demographic information, that as it shifts across your life, that means that the criteria will shift as well. So, for example, the answer I'm about to give to the criteria that I would look for now, or that I've looked for in my last several jobs, wouldn't have applied when I was 25 years old and looking for my first job. And I was just trying to get somewhere with somebody. We had live recruiting fairs at that time, so you could really get a gut feeling for the person. And I just wanted somebody that I felt good about and get a chance to go, because I knew I would build my career from there. So I'm not exactly that person anymore. I have a spouse who's an administrator, and I had 3 kids. So I had many more considerations to keep in mind when we were looking at leaving and going to a new school. But I think for me, what emerged, especially after my first job, is job satisfaction. As much as I'm an adventurous person and I love to explore different cultures, and that's why I want to be abroad, I knew that most of my time was going to be spent being a teacher, in the same way that I was a teacher in the US. I was going to be lesson planning. I was an English teacher, so I'm going to be marking stuff 7 days a week. So I really, really talked job satisfaction. And for me, what that meant was I need to be in a school that has similar values to mine in terms of human rights and human dignity and just a global perspective in line with maybe the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that kind of thing. And also pedagogically, I needed to be in a place whose mission is that students are active learners and that assessments are synthesis, not rote. And I needed to be in that kind of environment where I was creating dynamic lesson plans, lots of project-based learning. And even within IB, which I soon realized was going to sort of be my fate. So I looked for IB jobs. I was an IB English teacher. Then I learned to teach IB theory of knowledge. And then I learned to teach IB psychology. So looking for places that would allow me to be myself as a teacher and also to change roles and to do things differently and not have a really prescribed curriculum, but one that I could have a voice in. And then also let me jump between English and psychology and theory of knowledge so that I could be a happy, dynamic, effective teacher. And finally, I would say with that job satisfaction, those tended to be well-established, accredited schools, the kinds of places maybe that people have heard of that have deeper pockets to support the kind of PD that I would want to do, and that would also be great places for my children to go to school. So that's kind of where I ended up. I would say job satisfaction, number 1 for me.
All right, fellas, who wants to go next?
I'll go next. Okay, so, well, first of all, Amy, ditto. I mean, I think all the panelists here, all of our colleagues here are probably going to agree with everything that everyone says. So I'm going to have a little bit of a different take on that, on the school. And I picked reputation of the school, the demographics, and size of the school. So one at a time. schools may, and I think I may have heard, Amy, I may have heard you mention this before at one point about a school having a reputation of being a pressure cooker. And those ones where the staff is, for lack of a better term, overworked. I mean, where the standards are so high to where it's almost, you hit your point of, what's the word for it in economics? Point of diminishing returns, where they might need to just relax a little bit and let the staff, use their own expertise and get things done instead of causing the pressure cooker atmosphere. And I think anybody's been to an international school knows about that. About the size of the school, so smaller schools, and when I say smaller, I'm thinking of a smaller school in the size of maybe a few hundred, from pre-K on up to high school. That would be a smaller school. You might have a closer knit community feel. I've been to two schools, and both of them were around the 1,500 student body size, which is bigger. Obviously, there are ones that are I think there's some in Singapore that are like 2,000 and 3,000. But as you get into a student body that's into the thousands, 1,500, 2,000, you might end up with less of a closer knit school community because it's so spread out, maybe sometimes in 2 or 3 different campuses, whereas a smaller school would probably be all in one campus, and you would get to know the students and faculty easier. The demographics, meaning the students and what nationalities you might see there as you look out at your students. And this can also be something for people going abroad who have children. It's something I think to consider is who are your child's classmates going to be? Is it going to be a diverse group of kids from, Pakistan and Canada and Sweden and Germany? Who knows? Or might it be more of a homogeneous school where there are maybe 1 or 2 predominant nationalities of students there? Not that that's a bad thing. It's just something to consider. If the predominant nationality in the school, and when I say predominant, could be 80 to 90%, if they are of a completely different culture than your own children, that'd be something to consider. It might be a bit of a culture shock, but something to think about.
Thanks, David. Rob, what do you have?
Yes. So ditto to both of you, Amy and David. I would add one of the things that, really was the primary for my wife and I when we looked at all the different schools we worked at, really were the actual roles and responsibilities that the job entailed, to really understand, am I going to be floating between classrooms? Am I going to be doing something crazy? That needs to really be spelled out. And in some of the smaller schools, or schools, let's say, that are not as polished, that could be something you really get caught with. And that was our Lebanese experience. So one thing was presented, but the reality was very different once you were in country. So the job description, and then a big one for me is a culture of collaboration. So within the job, within the network of other teachers that you are interacting with, let's say on a daily basis or from a departmental perspective, are people collaborating, or do we have little silos and fiefdoms? That really makes a difference in terms of quality on the job. And so that really was my criteria. And the way that you would find that out is asking to interview or at least interact with colleagues that are either working there or have worked there. There are online resources as well that you can partake in. Sometimes you have to pay a small fee, but it is really worth getting a sense of what the vibe at the school is. It really gives you a sense of quality of life. The other thing I want to just mention, support services. If you do have kids, really want to know what are those potential support services available for A, kids in my classroom, but B, my own kids. If there's tutoring, advisory services, that sort of thing, what's available. So those are all things that were very important to me, factors we considered. All right, over to you, Amy.
So that was really interesting to hear some of what Rob was saying, because it made me remember that there's this really fine balance when you do go to those schools that I was talking about, these sort of reputable, well established, somebody who worked there and they know somebody who worked there, those kinds of really great schools. Some of those schools have a tendency to suffer from a great deal of entrenchment, because people go there and then they don't leave and they don't leave and they don't leave. And the whole point of having these sort of foreign teachers come and go is to continue to refresh and make the schools more dynamic. So I wouldn't have known that in my first 2 jobs. But especially as I was going toward European schools, I began to get a lot savvier about figuring out, is this a place where every time I have an idea, somebody's going to say, yeah, but we don't do that. Somebody 20 years ago tried that and it didn't work. Because for me, again, and I think it's knowing yourself. I know that that is not the place for me because I have an idea a second and I want to try stuff and I need a strong administrator who's going to be like, yes, you can do that. Those 8 things, wait till next year. But that they're seeking new ideas and they're seeking progress and transformation. So I think for listeners, knowing what kind of person that you are, because I know lots of people in Spain and Belgium who were very happy, people that I loved and respected, to stay in the same spot for 20 to 25 years and to just continue to teach in a very similar way within a hierarchy. And knowing that that's not me, I had to find other ways around that. So my next criteria, I would say, is in thinking about location. It's funny because everybody who's looking to go overseas is going to be thinking about location. And when I was just 24 when I was looking and I only had a year of experience and there weren't very many jobs that were available to me, right? So I didn't location was a dream that I thought not of. But since that time, when I think about location, we as a family have always said it doesn't really matter where we go, but we know that we need to be near a city because all of us love concerts and museums and theater. And if it's a Latin speaking culture, we know that we will be able to crack the language because we speak French, Spanish, and Portuguese or learned to along the way. So those are things that were really important to us. And also, a city can be more protective in terms of some of the identity factors. That's not always the case, but in terms of location, say my husband's Jewish, there are schools that we could never work at, right? He could never be the head of many schools. And one of my kids is queer. So what kind of place is going to be as accepting as possible for some, identity characteristic differences. And also another one of my kids is profoundly gifted and needed a program that really had no ceiling and needed a lot of cultural stimulation. So location, yeah, there's lots of places that I would love to go and open to everything. But when we really looked at our factors of our family, it was a smaller window than perhaps all the choices out there in the world.
Yeah, Amy, I got to agree with you on the location. Something for my family is, yeah, we want to be by a city too, where there are malls and supermarkets right down the street. So definitely agree with you on that. I wanted to tell you about one of my criterions for a school, and it has to do with they're so. Oh, before I start, I also wanted to mention when thinking about this podcast and for all the listeners going to a new school, what kept coming to mind is, can you find a buddy at the school? Can you find a friend of a friend who is already there? And I know that might be hard if it's your first school, but having somebody with the boots on the ground at the school, you can really find out a lot of things that you're wondering about the climate of the school and how things run and things like that. So find a buddy at the school that you can talk with before you move on further. So my second criteria is what type of after-school activities, athletics, theater, music, academic clubs, things like that are offered. And why that stuck out to me is, in my experience, after being in a couple of schools that had about 1,500 students, my children, who are now 25 and 23 years old, they were able to explore soccer after school, volleyball, track, robotics, rock band, playing guitar, things like that, and other activities. And some schools offer a big variety of after school extracurricular activities, and I think they're really important, especially if you have kids. If you don't have kids, it's also something to think about as a teacher, because chances are you're going to end up teaching one or two of those after school activities. And what could you offer as extracurricular after school stuff?
Yeah, so I'll just chime in. Totally agree, David, that just on the after school activities, thinking about what you bring to the table, what is something that would be fun that you could share as an after school activity to bring, value and interest and a new hobby to students is, a great interest, I think, to the school body to have you joining. And that certainly helped our kids. Both are out of the international school scene, but we're able to do track and field, frisbee, and swimming, and all kinds of great little activities that really, I think, helped to diversify their interests. So I think that was a really positive thing. Something that I would definitely look at in talking to, in through the hiring recruiting process. So new criteria for me really is we're talking a little bit about the location of a school and all of that. But one of the other factors we considered was really the country and the culture and the geography. And then what kind of weather are you dealing with? So Finland and Norway versus, let's say, somewhere in the Sahara. So, might it be a desert environment? Might it be four seasons like you're used to in the country that you're currently in? Might it be two seasons? Is it a really rainy tropical environment? For example, we were in Vietnam and I now have relocated to the desert environment because I do not need to live in the tropics anymore. Mosquitoes and 6 inches of rain every day didn't work for me, but it was a great experience. All of these kinds of things may not sound like a lot, but if you're in a place for 2 or 3 or 4 years, you really do get acclimatized. And I think it's really fun, but it's really important to be aware. It does impact your quality of life, particularly if it's not the kind of weather that you are looking for. So weather is a criteria to consider when you're thinking about locations. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for all those insights. And I'm going to throw things a little out of whack here and throw in a factor that we've mainly been coming at it from a married couple, kids. So I'm going to go into the Wayback Machine, grow a lot of hair, and pretend like I'm 28. All right. And I've got someone in my family who fits that description. So I'm going to throw in there at that stage of your life, if I can remember correctly, social, social, social. You want to connect to people. You want to potentially have some romance. You want to be able to get out and have lots of fun, whether there's an expatriate community that's strong or there's a local community that's strong. And all that sounds, hey, that shouldn't be so difficult to find out. So I've learned from one young man that you really need to check out how open is the local kind of youth population to outsiders. Is it insular? And I saw this in one country as an old fellow, but I'm also hearing it, and I'm talking about Max, my son, that was a big surprise for where he is. He's found folks to be very insular because they all grew up together. And so it's been a bit difficult. And then for the expatriate group, are they going to be within your age group? And then the school, back to what we were talking about, some of these super established schools, a lot of the faculty have been there a long time. So they're in their 40s and 50s. And if they're going to bring you in as the 28-year-old, what's that going to be like? So I just wanted to share that 28-year-old possibility as another way to look at these things. And I want to piggyback on Mr. D. Ross there. One of the things that schools will do is try to set you up with a buddy. But once you've been overseas and built that network, reach out and, like he's saying, find someone on the ground who can really give you the straight information as much as possible. All right, let's do another round. Who would like to go first? All right, Amy.
Great. I have another criterion. Before I say it, I'd just like to piggyback a little bit on what you said, David, about that intersection between who you are as a foreigner coming into the country and the local culture. And as a young person, when I was 25, the one country that I went into, we were those foreigners sort of living in a very, very, very small bubble. It was a Soviet satellite state. I was there with Audrey. We were in a very, very, very small bubble. But I think many of us did form relationships with people outside of school and people local. But it was nothing like what's possible, like in some other places. And I think, David, you were talking before about kids, but it might have been you, Rob, that there are some populations where it's going to be really easy for the adults or for the kids to get enmeshed with local people. And I think, it really is Do you know yourself and do you know your family? When I was young, I was willing to just go. And I said yes to every opportunity, and every friend who wanted to, local friend who said, do you want to? And I'd be like, yes, I do. Right. And then later, and when you have kids and you can't say yes to everything, but if you're the kind of person who wants to live at a place for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, investing in language skills, investing in programs where your kids can meet people who are from the home culture who aren't maybe from the school, like a local sports organization that isn't a part of the school as well. But for people, if you know you're only going to want to be someplace a year or two, that can be quite different from the attitude of really trying to, blend into the culture. And I've done it, the different ways. And I think that both have value. So the criterion that I was going to bring up was one that we haven't mentioned yet, but I'm sure it's on everybody's mind, and that is salary. And it fascinates me to talk to people who've taught overseas, because you will find people whose sole reason for going overseas is to make a lot of bank. And they looked at the landscape of being a teacher in the US or Canada, and they said, no way am I ever going to be able to make a retirement, send my kids to college. So there are people who are seeking out those jobs. And then there are a lot of us, I think, who don't rule those out, but it's not the sole criteria. And that also might change over time. Like when I was first starting out, Audrey and I in our first school, we didn't even make hard currency, right? We had local currency only. But we had a great time. Like it was a great time. I wasn't saving for anything,
I had a stack of local currency.
Yeah.
A
We
stack.
had a blast. We had a great life. But then sort of mid-career, when I realized that my own children probably wanted to go to school for college in the United States, and we hadn't been there to pay into Social Security, so we were like, oh, we are going to have to move to schools at least a couple of times where we can make the kind of money that we need to have that future that we're dreaming of, right? And I think we said no or didn't look at schools that weren't a good fit. But boy, were we looking for schools that were a good fit that also paid well. And we found a couple of those for us, and it worked out. And again, it's a little bit different because my husband's an administrator. But I think that salary for most of us is in there. The last thing I'd say about salary is that, especially for people who haven't been overseas yet, is that you might see the actual salary of a school and say, my God, I can never go there for that. That's way too low. But obviously, contextually, that might be a very nice salary. My salary in both European schools that I taught at looked really low. But when I had subsidized, I had a Metro card that I could use that was subsidized by the school and the government, universal healthcare. Actually, I didn't have that many things to spend my money on. I had lots of money, but it looked very low because everything else was handled by the school and the government.
I'll jump in there. Certainly, salary was something that was high in our criteria. And to Amy's point, totally agree. Without understanding the real economic situation in the country you're moving to, you really have no sense coming from where you are, right? So you're walking in many cases into a developing country, and a salary that, I'll throw a number out, let's say $30,000, may not sound very appealing at all. But when you realize that you could eat, for example, in Vietnam or in Malaysia or Indonesia for 50 cents or $1, your savings potential is actually quite impressive. Can we save one salary? Can we save a fraction of one salary? Are in-country taxes really high? Or is saving potential really positive? Is there some kind of retirement fund set aside? So all of those things, these are factors that may not sound important, but once you're there, they really are. The other part of the income package that's important is your housing. That was also a big deal to us. Once you live in a really good situation, it kind of goes higher up on the list for us. Where is the school located? Is it in a downtown metropolitan huge city like Buenos Aires? Or is it in kind of a remote suburban area with farmland around it? Because your housing in many cases is covered somewhat or fully covered. It really depends on the school. But this is a wonderful benefit to think about. And so maybe this will be my new criteria to kick off, but your housing benefits are a very important aspect of living overseas. Where am I going to live? Is it going to be an apartment? Am I going to be far away from school? Am I going to have to take a bus to get to school? Am I going to need my own transportation? Can I take public transportation? Does public transportation exist? Can I buy a bicycle and ride to school? So all of those things are really important in the recruiting process to ask about. I bring this up because one of the schools we were at gave us an entire house with several acres of land, and we lived very well. It was kind of hard to compare that after the fact. And that actually was very appealing in making the decision to go to the school where we went. It was actually in Zimbabwe. So I'll just throw this out to the group. I think housing is such a game changer in terms of quality of life. Are your neighbors living right next to you? Are they locals, with paper thin walls? And you're going to hear all of the things that happen in a particular culture. I've lived in that experience. Are you going to be in a local residential building, or are you going to be in a building owned by the school? Many schools own different facilities and manage them and take care of all of it. In other cases, you'll be given a stipend, and particularly in many European countries and larger Asian cities, you'll be expected to go out and find, with a realtor or a school resource, to find your own housing. And so housing can be a lot of moving parts, and I think a very important factor to mention.
I want to piggyback on what Rob was saying in terms of your housing setup could really affect your entire experience in terms of what Amy was talking about with community. Because if you are with other teachers and that's your thing, if that's what you enjoy, so like in Saudi, we lived on compounds, there was a pool, there was a rec center, there was a field, we had our own setup. We did trick or treating and we did Easter egg hunts and all that, all within the school community. And I loved it. That was my thing. And we were a smallish group and you got to know everyone. It felt very safe and comfortable. And then, say, when we were in Rome, we got our own apartment and we weren't near anybody. And it affects the extent to which your school peeps are your community or not. And neither is good or bad. It's just, what do you prefer and maybe what stage of life you're at. So if I was to look at myself as a single woman going overseas for the first time with one foot in retirement, let's say, I might want to be near the school community, or I might be the party animal that wants to be out. Who knows? But yeah, it all depends on your perspective. But housing, I think you're right. It's a very important piece.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that as well. And I think, Rob, it's a really good point about the housing, and that for those people just getting into international teaching, yes, often there is a stipend for it. Our particular first situation in Malaysia, our housing stipend was more than the actual price of our house. And like you, Rob, you had this really nice house and you lived really well. And so did we. We had a 4-bedroom house overlooking this valley, this lush valley. And we actually kind of had a few bucks extra from the housing stipend. And that also has to do with what you were talking about, Rob. A salary may seem low, but when you factor in the cost of living in the country you're going to, and that, of course, could very well offset the lower salary. And you could end up being able to save a lot more with that lower salary than you would if you stayed in your home country. One criteria that popped in my mind is the fact that there are for-profit schools out there and not-for-profit international schools. And I don't know the exact details of it, but in general, I believe it's the schools that are for-profit schools, and I've had friends work there at these types of schools where it's a business, and I mean, they're all businesses, but a for-profit school, they make money, and I think some of the profits, maybe a lot of the profits, go to CEOs and management, as opposed to a not-for-profit school. The money, all of it, it gets reinvested into the school, resources for the school, curriculum, maybe modernizing a building or making a new building for classrooms. And the general consensus, and this conversation comes up a lot with teachers that they have over the last 15 or so years, is, oh, you're going to a new school? Is it a for-profit school or is it a not-for-profit school? That's kind of a big question you ask. And the general census is that people like to go to a not-for-profit school because they know that money is going back into the school to better the programs and maybe offer more professional development opportunities, student resources, and things like that. So yeah, I was wondering what you guys thought about the profit versus not-for-profit status of an international school.
So we had Greg Perry on one of our more recent shows, and he is a businessman, but he's also an international educator, and he works with a family-run business that helps set up new international schools. And we've spoken to some heads of school and other folks about and I'll use the term wave, this wave of international schools. A lot of them in areas that they haven't been going into, in countries in Africa, for example. Asia, it's been going on for quite some time, in China. And I'm not going to speak anymore as I'm not an expert, but I just think the reality is more than ever, that's what a lot of teachers are going to see in front of them when they go out to look and see the possibilities. And one of the things that Greg was saying, looking at their vision, looking at their mission, and getting underneath the hood and finding out if the vision and mission are what we would feel comfortable with, it's student-centered, find out if it's really happening. So that's one take I would add, so people can go listen to that. And we've spoken to some other folks too. It's just the numbers are growing like crazy. So do your research.
I think, Audrey, you wanted to add on to that as well? Or?
Sure. Just to say that it all depends on the school, like David was saying. And I never would have thought back in the day that I would have come across in defense of the for-profit schools. There are so many of them out there now that it's much, much harder to steer clear of them, let's say. And so I think it's more important to just do your best to find out. And again, maybe you can talk to someone who's there, what the real boots on the ground kind of feeling is. It's more important to find out the people that own and make the decisions about the school. How do they feel about education? Is education important to them or not? Then whether it's necessarily a for-profit or a not-for-profit school.
And let me throw in there what I see on Reddit again and again is the way it comes through for some of these for-profit schools is the workload. That people are just worked, and as much as they can get out of them. And there's no sense of community, a sense of valuing you as an individual. Again, this is just some of them, but that was one factor. If you can get hold of people and ask them the question, what's the workload like? How are you supported? And as what was brought up earlier, how are you supported with professional development? Is there much for that? Amy, what do you think?
I'm really interested in this idea that you said about sort of looking under the hood. I think it is much more difficult to do that when you're just starting out, right? Because the knowledge gap. I mean, if I were just starting out or advising someone, there are lots of things that I would just not tell people to worry about too much, right? Just go, have some criteria, check it out as best you can. And then, once you're there and you've done one job for a couple of years, you'll have a much better sense of what you like and what works for you. But if we are talking about people who are mid-career or on their second or third, or in my case, sixth school, eighth school, some of the things that I've realized, and part of this is maybe being married to a head of school, is that if you think about it, there is no way for independent schools, whether they're in the US or abroad, they can't run on tuition. There just isn't enough money. I work at a school right now that has a huge tuition that would shock most people, but the school can't run on that. It has to have an endowment, it has to have fundraising if it's going to pay teachers, right? Or if it's going to have resources, or if it's going to have a good building. It's not possible to do all the things just on a tuition-driven school, which is everybody. So I think one of the things that I became more sensitive to as I was going from school to school is, where is the thing that doesn't get as much money, right? And so it might be an old building that in one of the schools, we were in a really old building and I had no space. It was a great school. I loved it. And they had great programs and great teachers, but I knew that there was no money to have a really richness in school spaces or in resources. And that was fine because it was clear that that wasn't the priority. I think one of the more invisible things, though, that's a little bit insidious is the inequities that arise between foreign hire teachers and local teachers. And I've been in schools that were very acrimonious, and there was a lot of resentment, and where it wasn't handled very well historically, and there was good reason for the resentment. And then I've been in schools where things were quite transparent, and there was open dialogue among the faculty so that a divide wasn't created between local hire and foreign hire. So for people who are just listening to this kind of thing for the first time, these schools have sort of a history of people who are already living in the country. Perhaps it's not as expensive to live in. It's not as housing isn't expensive. They already have housing because they live there or whatever, that they tend to have a lower package than people who are coming in from overseas, partly because the thinking goes in these schools is that the community needs native English speakers and people coming in from outside that have new ideas and that have curricular experience that would bring value. I think all of that is true. But there was one school I was at where local teachers and foreign hire teachers were not even on the same basic pay scale. It wasn't just a difference in package, which we can talk about, the differences in package and benefits and how equitable that is. But this was just two people with 8 years experience doing the exact same job, not getting the same base pay salary. And boy, that is a rough position to be in on either side, because there was a real divide amongst the faculty, and it made it much harder to be friends with local people and to have a good unity and good feeling in the school. And that was addressed right away. Like it blew up and then it was addressed, and then things were much, much, much better. So being aware when you go into a school that the package that you have with a flight home or free housing and that kind of thing may not be the same thing that the local people are getting, which might be okay depending on where you are and how transparent the admin is and the history of the school. Or it might be something where you're walking into a bit of a bee's nest that you'll get in trouble if you're not aware that that's going on. So that's one of the under the hood kind of things, I'd say.
I'll just throw in that I was at two schools where there was that conflict that Amy's talking about. Really difficult, actually, because, we'd be in your first 2 or 3 months and having these initial discussions and then debates as to, well, we've been hired by the school because, we're native speakers and we're, coming with this experience. And many of the students and the students' families want to have people, for example, with an American accent. That really is something that many students' families are looking for. They want their kids to have an American accent or a Canadian accent or a British accent. And so these are factors that it's very important to inquire about during the recruiting process, to ask, is there a union situation? There was one situation where the headmaster was actually conferring with me. This was a huge school, but was really having a hard time with very serious local pressure. So we decided after 2 years to leave that school. But it was still a great experience, but something you need to be aware of. A totally great point, Amy. So just a new topic to flip to. One of the things that I wanted to mention, I know everybody here has had some experience with it, is when you're looking at a school and trying to understand the culture of the school, one of the things is around wellness. And is wellness something that's really honored at the school? And this could dovetail into what Amy was talking about, David and Aubrey, everybody was talking about around, do staff get PD? Are staff honored? Are they looked upon with respect? Or are they robots and, just there to do a job and then to leave? And so a wellness program is something that many progressive schools are using in the classroom. Mindfulness, health and wellness being taught as part of the curriculum. And then the same goes for staff. Are staff part of a wellness program, or is there a wellness program to assist staff in A, making a transition, but B, in helping with quality of life? And so I've certainly had that experience, but I'm going to put this out to the group. I think it's an interesting topic. I'm curious what others have seen in their work experience.
I'll jump on that if that's okay. Rob, I thought about that as well, about wellness, and I actually have an interview question. When one gets to the interview point, And I've asked this before in interviews before going to a school. And the question was, if I were to walk down the halls of the school, what would I see? What would I hear? And what would the vibe be among students and faculty? And would I see a lively, respectful interactions between the students and staff? Would there be like welcoming, comfortable learning areas and inviting learning areas for the students at whatever age? I mean, elementary, middle, or high school. And I think that that is something that we as teachers are going to be around all the time, not to mention the students, of course, they're going to be around it. And I think that has a really big connection with wellness. So I do agree with the wellness. This is just a different take on it.
Yeah, I also am thinking about wellness and from the angle of, do you get the sense that this is a school that cares about everyone thriving? And part of everybody thriving is, differentiation that we do in the classroom, which for me would be sort of a must have kind of thing, that it's that kind of environment where teachers are scaffolding different things for different kinds of learners, academic differences, cultural differences, social emotional differences, but also for the teachers as well. Like, does my administration care about my thriving? And do they want to run the kind of school that can result when you have a lot of people getting what they need and what they want? And how do they manage that? And then, of course, what if something does go wrong? What kind of guidance and support systems would there be for me? What kind of guidance and support systems would there be for my kids? And that might also just be things like college counseling support, because I had high school kids who were wanted to go to college in the US. What kind of support were they going to get to help them thrive and make those decisions? And the medical care, is it something that we could really count on? I mean, it's probably not like Belgium, where if I had to call in sick because of one of my children was sick, the Belgian government sends you an RN to your house. And it costs like three euros an hour, and they're going to get a lot better care from that RN than they're ever going to get from me. So it doesn't have to be to that extent. But what happens if I have to leave for a month, like I did when my dad was dying, and I left my school in Brazil, and they found a way to cover it so that I could go and not be there. So, real thriving on the end of possibilities, but also thriving in who's there if something bottoms out. And I want to know that I'm going to be supported by the school, even if it's not a wealthy school. It's more the attitude of the school culture itself that I want to know would be there for me.
Thank you for bringing up or continuing the discussion on wellness, which is another huge theme that the heads of school we talk to bring up, but also the flip side of that. I'll call it crisis management broadly and individually. And as D. Ross put into our discussion area, that's a whole nother huge discussion of it wasn't that long ago with COVID, and we kind of forget it. And so that is a question for a school. What is your crisis management plan? Let's do the big umbrella or like an upside down triangle, the big broad, but let's bring it down to the individual. As Amy, you're saying, what are ways that you support individual needs within your school? And then we can branch off into neurodivergent students, the gifted kids, and of course the kids in the middle. There's so many discussion points. And as David brought up, having your questions ready if you're on a Zoom call or you're face to face, to, I'll use my term, get under the hood and find out what's really going. All right, with that said, let's do a final kind of check-in. If you have a word of advice, one more criterion that you would like to add as we wrap up. My descriptor of whenever we get together is rich. It's just rich discussion from such experience, and you guys and gals are so knowledgeable. So thank you. But let's wrap up. Rob, I'm going to point right to you there, my friend.
Sure.
What do you say?
Well, I think one of the top criteria with all the things we talked about still has to be excitement. Does this place excite you? Is there something about it that you really want to get out of this experience? It could be the geography. Salary is to the side, but is it the geography? Is it the culture? Is it something going on politically that you're fascinated with? Is it the food? Is it the vacation proximity that you have based on where you are. So I would say excitement.
Totally agreed. Totally agreed. Took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, if you're not excited, if something doesn't grab at you right away and pique your interest, then that might be a good sign to, look at other options maybe. But good point. I couldn't have said it better myself, Mr. Howe.
For me, I think it's on similar lines through the lens of being a psychology teacher. And I'm also a social emotional skills teacher in high school. So we talk a lot about decision making and what makes good decision making. And I think this idea, it's necessary to go through the cognitive process of doing the lists. You have to do the values clarification. You have to make the lists. You have to say, what would we accept? What would be ideal? What would be a good career move? Even if it's not the thing I want right now, being practical, being realistic, make those lists and go through them. And then from the list, really getting those emotional signals like Rob and David are talking about, right? Like we have all many times been in the situation where we make a pros and cons list and then something pops up and we're like, yeah, this doesn't fit, but I'm doing it anyway. And, it could be said that with our enteric nervous system being in our gut, that we literally sometimes have shit for brains when we follow our gut instincts. But I think most of the time, if you've already done the cognitive work, having the push from your gut that just goes, no, I know this is going to be okay. I know, this is me in the lunch line meeting the guy from Ethiopia going, yeah, come to Ethiopia and be my tennis partner. I was like, okay, like that's not at all what I was planning. But yeah, you seem great. And he was great. And it worked out great. So doing the work, but then letting your gut weigh in really strongly.
So you don't have to tick all the boxes necessarily.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of them.
Don't list yourself right out of the magic.
Yeah, I agree. I can't imagine the prospect of going to a place that I did not feel excited to go to. That sounds really difficult. Thank you, everybody, for once again bringing all your wisdom and experience to the table and for working with this a little bit unusual format where we're kind of who's jumping in and next and figuring it all out, and really appreciate everybody's input. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's always fun. It's always a good discussion, rich discussion.
Mm-hmm.
It is. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, it's so fun. Makes me wish I could just dump this all and go back right now.
Cheers, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.